Hello Internet, Seth Skorikowski, and today we're going to talk about role-playing social encounters in your tabletop RPG. We refer to them as role-playing games, but while character actions such as climbing and fighting, those are really easy for us to understand. Okay, not totally easy, there's still a lot of debate and how-tos concerning those. Social actions, when our characters are talking to NPCs, those cause a lot of confusion, and that's suddenly when we start having debates concerning, role-playing the conversation out in character or simply rolling a die to determine the results, and people get really passionate about these debates. One side declares that it's roleplay over roleplay, since this is a role-playing game after all, while the other side declares how players aren't required to physically lift a rock when they're performing a strength check, or physically pick a lock at the table in order to pick one in-game, so a character's intelligence and charisma actions shouldn't require any sort of intelligence or social ability from the player around the table. My approach to it is somewhere in the middle because I find both extremes problematic. The role player wants to act it out in their performance and their personal charisma at the table being the deciding factor, rather than rolling a dice for that check. That's a little bit too far for me. A character's charisma stat and their social skills need to matter. Otherwise, you're going to simply have players turn their charisma into a dump stat, since player charisma is evidently all that counts, and I don't like that. And many players have difficulty playing a character who is more or less charismatic than themselves. On the flip side, I also really dislike the comparison of intelligence or social obstacles being the same as dexterity or strength obstacles in game, and how a player's personal abilities shouldn't matter at all when it comes to social checks. The reason being is that tabletop RPGs are intellectual and social games. Players are regularly required to use their own intelligence to formulate an attack strategy or overcome some obstacle, like how do our characters cross this ravine? Or in their social games because we're playing them around a table. That's why the bulk of my player and game master mistakes videos are all about proper communication, getting along with the rest of the players. It's a social game. So unlike physical abilities like strength or dexterity, a player's social ability is inherently part of the game by its very nature. So this video is about how I run social interactions at my table. Now this is going to be system neutral, meaning it doesn't matter if you're playing D&D or Call of Cthulhu, Cyberpunk, Traveler, the same general concepts apply, though the particular rules of the specific game that you're playing might make an exception or two. First, let's talk about role-playing. When we get into our character's mind and their actions and behaviors based off of their motivations and personality rather than our own. Many players take this a step further, giving their character a special voice or accents or physical mannerisms that they act out around the table, such as they always hunch their shoulders or they point their finger when they're talking to you, like Harrison Ford. Now that is fun and entertaining, and I love it. I recommend it. It can really help roleplay a whole lot, but in all honesty, it's not necessary to do that. Talking in a character voice is great, but that by itself is not roleplay. It's theatrics. Roleplay is the character's actions being true to the character's personality. Talking in a fun voice doesn't necessarily mean that the character's actions are consistent with their personality, and that's the only part that actually matters. Everything after that is just icing on the cake. So while I love it if a player gets into character by acting out with their voice and their physical mannerisms, and I encourage my players to do that, I also don't require them to do that at all. Some people just don't enjoy acting it out around the table, but they can still be fantastic role players. Now that being said, when a character engages in a social encounter, I want to know how they approach it. A lone guard stands before the gate, his gaze cautiously watching the crowd. We've got to get past this guy. Don't worry, dude. I approach him and 24 on the deception. What is it you say? It doesn't matter. I made the roll. Well, that was dull, wasn't it? Now, in my games, I demand more. First, the game master needs to be 100% certain what the goal of the roll is. Now, in this example, it was mostly obvious. The character wanted to get past the guard. But does that simply mean that they wanted the guard to let them through or the guard to leave their post? And sometimes it's less obvious exactly what the player wants to achieve whenever they're making any sort of social roll. Social skills are just like any other skills in the game. But because social encounters have a bit more complexity to the tasks around them, such as climbing a building or shooting a gun at a bad guy, with those we can easily assume what the desired outcome of that is. With social encounters, what exactly the players are wanting to do with it, that needs to be established before the roll is made. So players, always announce what your intended result is. Game Masters, if you aren't 100% sure what the outcome the player is wanting, ask for that before you call for them to roll. I have a whole video on the importance of players needing to say what they want if you'd like to know more about that. Some encounters, the player might want something that is so simple that there's not even going to be a roll required for that, like asking what time it is. Other things might be a little bit more difficult, all the way up to average difficulty to impossible. And if a player wants something that's impossible, like asking that guard to hand over their armor and weapons and give them to this random player character that they never met before, and that's not going to happen, don't even ask the player to roll for that because that's an impossible task. Next, the Game Master needs to know what the character says that sparks the roll. Not word for word acting it out, but at least the general direction of attack. And that can really help determine what skill is needed to be rolled. I'm going to loom over and cracking my knuckles. Tell us where the idol is or you're going to be eaten through a straw. Okay, roll an Intimidate check. Yeah, my Intimidate ain't that good, but my Charm is great, so I was kind of hoping I could roll that instead. Well, what you said is clearly an Intimidate. What would you like to say that's charming instead? Yeah, let me think about this. That particular exchange I have done many times around the table, where the player's approach doesn't align with what skill it is that they want to use. Usually I'm just going to let the player reapproach that situation differently and use the particular skill that they're wanting to use, which is preferably the one that the player character is really good at, and therefore is the one that the player character would have more likely used when they were approaching that situation. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up a chair and sit down beside him, maybe even offer him a smoke and say, hey, this ain't nothing personal, ain't nothing about you, he's just doing his job, but his boss stole something that's kind of dangerous and we need to get that back before innocent people get hurt, so if he could just tell us where that idol is, we'll be on our way. Excellent. Give me a charm check, or even a persuade if you like. Also, it helps determine exactly what it is the NPC is going to do as a response to the player's roll. I run up to the guard shouting, help, help, a giant toad came up out of the sewer and swallowed a little boy. Roll deception. 24. Gripping his halberd tight, he goes charging off in the direction that you came from, leaving the gate unguarded. Of course, a clever approach is going to help them with this. If they say a lie that's plausible to the bad guy is more likely going to believe that lie. If they use something that the bad guy holds dear, such as mentioning how the bad guy's children can finally get those new shoes that they've been needing if the bad guy accepts this bribe, I'm going to give the player character a bonus, maybe lowering the difficulty or something for them being clever, maybe give them an inspiration. However, I'm still always going to require a die roll for this. Eloquent phrasing or an impassioned speech by the player, that might earn him a bonus or an inspiration or something, but it's still the character's ability is what's going to be the deciding factor, which means we've got to roll. Some players have complained or they get upset about how they've made a sound argument or a beautiful monologue only to fail this die roll and how that is not fair that they should fail that, but I think it's perfectly fair. After all, how the player phrases or acts out what it is that the character says, that's merely what the character intended to say. The die roll determines how well the character actually says it, which, I think we've all been there, right? We say something in our heads that's particularly clever or funny, but then it just falls flat. That's pretty much been my reality since I started a YouTube channel. So that die roll determines if the player character maybe ended that lie with like a little grin or had a little bit of desperation in their manner when they were attempting to do that seduction roll. They might have said everything that the player said word for word, but it just didn't come out the way that they hoped they would. Or they might have said it far better than the player ever could because the character has a better charisma than the player has. Now, one caveat to earlier when I talked about impossible rolls, like walking up to a wealthy heiress and trying to get them to marry you with a single roll, that is not going to happen. I don't care what your charisma is. It's not a mind control spell. If an NPC is just definitely not going to do something, you're not going to get them to do it. However, one exception to that is if the player is intending the social encounter to be part of a longer project. Things like a courtship or a long con scam, those are not a single roll task. They might require a certain number of skill checks made out over multiple encounters, each check, chipping away at the overall difficulty until we can finally earn the NPC's trust and can achieve what the player wants. To me, that is totally possible, but again, the Game Master needs to know what the player's intention is, that they're wanting to make this part of a long-term project, and that way the Game Master can set a ladder of difficulty to determine how it is we're going to make this impossible task, break it down into smaller chunks and make that overall goal attainable to the player character. Now let's talk about difficulty modifiers. Not the modifiers for the plan of attack, we just covered those, but these are for the game mechanics, such as sensing motive. This exists in a lot of games, where they're inside insight in D&D, psychology in Call of Cthulhu, human perception in Cyberpunk. I love this skill. Normally it's treated how a character detects deception, how to see if somebody is lying to them. But I see this skill, no matter which game it's in, as the ability to read other people, meaning the character can use that skill to determine what is the best skill to manipulate them. So a player character could look over an NPC, and with a successful roll, they could determine that a persuasion check is going to be more effective against this NPC than a charm or a deception is, and I would roll something that if you're now going to use a persuasion against them because you've used this insight check, you get a bonus for that. Or if you fail that roll, you can't get a good reading. You can't really tell which one's going to be best, so now the player's just left to figure it out on their own. Or if they fail that insight roll, that ability to read them really badly, if you've got scaled failures or if it's a fumble, if you have something like that, then you can make it where it's now something else, like Intimidate is what you should use on them. But the truth is, if they try Intimidate, that's going to incur a penalty because that is the worst skill you could possibly use against this NPC. You could also set this up as a task chain between multiple player characters. One character reads the mark, determining which skill is the most effective. And then the player character that's got the best charm or deception or whatever it is, they tell them, okay, Intimidation's not going to work on this guy, but we can butter him up. That's going to work best. Turning the social encounter into more of a group effort that we now have multiple player characters kind of working together in order to get whatever it is they want. Another thing to keep in mind is how does the player character look? How do they present themselves, or how are they dressed? Convincing that guard to leave their post and deal with that possible riot or that giant toad that just ate a child, that's a lot easier to sell if your character is dressed like another guard or some well-to-do, upstanding citizen versus looking like some sort of murderous weirdo that's waving a pistol around. This is where in Cyberpunk we can use skills such as personal grooming or wardrobe and style, measuring how well the character looks the part for whatever it is that they're trying to sell. And not just how the character looks, but what it is that character is presenting. A woman licking a strawberry ice cream cone doesn't give the same impression as her licking a bloody hammer. Also consider the character's reputation. Is this player character known to the NPC? In a previous adventure, if the PC saved the city from giant bugs, they might be looked at a little bit more favorably than in a previous adventure if they had previously burned the harbor down or got locked in an insane asylum. Some games also have mechanical measures for this. Call of Cthulhu is the credit rating score, which is a measure of their wealth and status, and people tend to look at more favorably at the player character that's trying to get something out of them if that PC is wealthy and influential. Same thing with social class. If the player character belongs to an upper class or a lower class family, regardless of how much money or that they might personally have, that can really change how people react to them. Yeah, sure, you're the sixth child of a minor noble who's struggling to keep the family estate, but you're still nobility, and we're still going to treat you like you're nobility. A character's occupation can also be a factor. If they're a police officer and the NPC knows this, they might be more trusting of them or willing to go along with whatever it is the player character wants them to do. After all, they're a cop. Or, in some circles, knowing that the player character is a cop is going to absolutely hurt their chances of getting the NPCs to trust them. Reputation is measured in some games like Cyberpunk, and it's used in intimidation checks, or what they call face downs. Now, face downs are presented as being a combat thing, but I also say that a character's reputation, whether it's good or bad, and their ability to intimidate, that should absolutely be applied to all social encounters as well. Now, speaking of intimidation, let's look at that. Intimidation is a type of persuasion. In some games, they just lump intimidation and persuasion together. But instead of the subject feeling like, maybe they've gotten a good deal out of this or come out ahead, they're going to feel threatened or inferior to the player character. Now, in some games like D&D, they link that to charisma, and I don't agree with that. Strength, physical size, that might be more appropriate if the player character is looming over the NPC. Or in the case of wanting to intimidate an academic, intelligence might be best, making this NPC feel small against your superior intellect. So I feel that intimidate, depending on how the character is wanting to use that particular skill, that should depend most on whichever characteristic stat that it is that they're going to be using to intimidate them with. Which, that's exactly the way Traveler and Noctung Cthulhu do it, where you add whichever stat that you feel is most appropriate to the situation of the skill test being rolled. Or in games like Call of Cthulhu, we don't add a characteristic modifier to skill rolls, but I believe that a character, if they possess an extremely high or low score in appearance, that should probably help or hinder their ability to charm an NPC if they're really really attractive or really ugly, while their size stat could really help or hinder their intimidate if they're exceptionally big or they're exceptionally small. Now, taking these modifiers and everything into account, let's look at the movie John Wick. John sneaks up behind a door guard, presents his pistol, and is all, "Hey Francis, you've lost weight." And Francis the guard is all, "Oh hi John, I lost 60 pounds, which is my way of telling you that there's 60 bad guys inside. Tell you what, I think I'm gonna go home if that's cool with you." And John is all, "All right, take care Francis." That is a badass intimidation, but nothing was ever spoken about it. Instead, we had him sneak up behind a guard, use his reputation as a badass assassin, present the threat of a gun, and that's when the player rolled their intimidation. No monologues and character voices around the table, no posturing or threats, just leaning into the modifiers and letting those do the talking for the player character. Next, let's look at long social interactions, something more than just a quick back and forth exchange, but a full conversation. I run a lot of mystery and investigative games with long social encounters, with a colorful cast of NPCs. That is a pretty normal thing around our table. Sometimes the player characters enter that conversation seeking specific information, so they begin with some normal chit-chat, then try to steer towards that important topic or that important line of questioning that they have. Other times the player character has no particular agenda going on with that encounter or during that conversation, like maybe this is a party and they're just mingling with a lot of people. Now as the game master, maybe I'm going to drop you one or maybe multiple pieces of information or clues. They're going to kick off that adventure, maybe be important to that adventure later on. Now some gamers, they want to act out this entire conversation, immerse themselves in it, get some realistic dialogue going on. Problem is that no one actually wants realistic dialogue. We want an idealized version of what we imagine dialogue sounding like. Movies or books, even ones that are praised for their realistic and snappy dialogue, it's not realistic. Real conversations are a bumbling mess of small talk that wander around, some topics being touched on before veering off into some random side topic. Writers have a limited time to get in and drop all the important information, punch it up with some clever flavor banner and get back out so we can get back to the story. That's why nobody says goodbye before hanging up the phone in movies. A simple conversation in a movie or in a novel, that might have taken hours or even days for the author, toiling over how to introduce these 3 points in a way that feels natural, with one flowing into the other. So it's almost impossible for multiple people that are sitting around a table to naturally do that, especially if one side isn't privy to where the conversation needs to go and what information needs to be imparted to them. So instead of playing out the entire conversation, don't be afraid to seize and summarize it. Maybe play out the opening, then fast forward to the important part. After a few more drinks and some stories about his time in the Great War, he leans back in his chair, pats his stomach, and says that was a good meal. Then I'm going to light a cigar, maybe even offer him one, and say, "So I was driving up the coast road a few days ago to visit some old college friends, the Murphy brothers. Anyway, I noticed that somebody had purchased the old Rudecker house. About time, too. Money pit, if you ask me. Probably best just to tear that thing down and build a new one." So I was wondering if you knew anything about this new owner. Or if the player has made it clear before the conversation that they're wanting to ask about a specific subject throughout this encounter, you can even bypass the player having to awkwardly broach the subject and just get straight to it. After a few drinks and some stories about his time in the Great War, you manage to swing the conversation over to the old Rudecker house. Cool, then I'm going to ask him if he's heard anything about this new owner. "Some out-of-towner. The whole thing was brokered by his lawyer, Mr. Weatherby." And he pats his pockets and he pulls out a card that he hands to you. "Guy must have a ton of money to blow. The decrepit place is falling apart, vacant for the last 10 years. Probably best just to tear that thing down and build a new one." Sometimes the game master might have several hooks or clues that they need to impart to the player. Now maybe there's something that the player is already interested in, or maybe they concern something that the player isn't aware of or the player hasn't even thought about yet. So instead of doing this sort of clumsy dance of you trying to steer this conversation one direction to give them this important clue that they're going to need, and the player not knowing that there's going to be important information imparted to them, they're now awkwardly trying to steer the conversation the other way, and you're both getting frustrated, and now the scene is taking way longer than necessary, and there's some of those people are just sitting around the table kind of looking at you and, oh my God, will one of you get on with this? And that key information, it might not get told because you just simply don't have a natural way of bringing that in. So just simply skip the introduction of how we even got there and just tell the player what the character needs to know. At some point during the dinner, he mentions that the Rudeckers and 3 other families got into some sort of huge feud about 200 years ago. No one even knows what started this feud anymore, but then an illness seemed to sweep the area and it wiped out all of the families except for the Gilwraiths over on the west side of town. Isn't Thomas Gilwraith the mayor?
Ah, yes, sir. Half the mayors of this town have been Gilwraiths, and the other half have been married to them, though Brian Miller wasn't a Gilwraith at all, but he was only mayor for a year before he passed away. Some sudden illness, if I recall.
When it comes to longer conversations or interrogations where the player might be asking or answering a bunch of questions or the subject may be wandering around a lot, game masters, they can make the mistake of asking for multiple rolls for the duration of this encounter. A deception check for every single time they make a lie, or an insight check every time the NPC says something that the player character wants to know if they're being honest or not. So instead of making a bunch of rolls, because no matter how good their skills are at this, they're eventually going to fail a roll. That's just the law of averages. So just roll a single time for the entire conversation. Do this after the player announces what it is that they want the NPC to do, and we've determined what skills it is that we're going to be using for this. And you can either do this, at the very beginning of the conversation, just right when it begins, or at the moment in the social encounter when that first roll is going to be required. And now that roll applies to the entire conversation from that point forward. Now, of course, this is all going to be case by case, depending on the situation of your game and the system of game that you're playing, but most of the time, I only call for a single social roll once per interaction, and then we just simply apply that result for the rest of the conversation, and that has saved us a lot of time and a lot of frustration. The same holds true for smaller social encounters that are umbrellaed into the same task, such as gathering rumors around town or at a party. We don't need to play out half a dozen conversations from random NPCs making roll after roll. We can simply make a single skill roll, and if the game master wants, we can either play out those individual moments that the player character learned a certain rumor, like a montage, or let the game master just simply give them a summary of how that went. This is like in a cop show. A murder happens and the cops are questioning 20 witnesses and neighbors, but it only shows us the one or two that gave us information that pushed the story forward. It doesn't even show us the rest of them, or it just simply cuts to them being back at the station, kind of summarizing what it was that they learned. It didn't even show us the part where they learned that because all we needed was the summary. If they fail their skill check, how you proceed depends on the game system you're playing and the specific situation that you're in. But generally speaking, there's a few ways that you might consider for this. First, maybe there's another skill that can be used instead. If you weren't able to deceive them, maybe you can intimidate them instead. Or if one character failed to deceive or persuade an NPC, maybe another character can step in and try one of those skills. Personally, I think an NPC should react to a failed attempt to manipulate them and not just let each member of the party go through all of their social roles one at a time until one of them gets a success. That is extremely boring. So maybe during a social encounter, any skill to influence an NPC may only be attempted one time, regardless of which character rolls that. Only a single deception, one intimidate, so on. Maybe each successive roll becomes more difficult and more cost involved to represent the NPCs becoming less and less amenable to whatever it is that the player characters want. Call of Cthulhu, which is my favorite role-playing game, has what they call pushed rolls, where a player character, if they fail a skill check, they can attempt it again, but failure on that second roll means more serious consequences for that. So in Call of Cthulhu, instead of each character getting a fast talk check before anyone pushes the roll by making a second attempt, I have it where the NPC is only subject to 2 attempts total, the initial roll and then the pushed roll. So if player A fails their persuasion check, they can try it again, or player B might step in and try their persuade or an intimidate roll, but whatever it is and whoever does it, the next roll to influence that non-player character counts as the pushed roll, and that's what risks serious consequences. Another thing to consider is when the player character fails their roll for the entire conversation. Now, when exactly does that failure occur? A game master might decide that there was some information that didn't require a roll for the player character to get it, so the game master's still going to give the player character that information. After all, they didn't need a roll to get it in the first place. However, the information that did require that they have to make a successful roll in order to get that, they're not going to get that because they didn't make the roll. Or maybe while the roll was failed, it was still really close to being a success. So maybe that failure didn't happen just right out the gate at the very beginning of the conversation. The NPC might have imparted some information or start going along with this manipulation before the failure occurred, maybe 15 minutes into this conversation. Like they start telling the PC some secret, then all of a sudden they clam up, realizing that they've said too much. Or that guard they're trying to persuade to let them inside the fortress, they might start letting the player characters in, opening the gate, letting them through, and all of a sudden realize that, oh no, I've made a mistake. mistake. It's a lot like failing a climb check when you're trying to climb over a 20-foot wall. Did the player character fall when they just climbed up 1 foot, or once they made it up 15 feet? The game master can determine that, well, no, the player character didn't get the full thing it is that they were wanting the NPC to do. It, at the same time, wasn't a total failure. Anyway, that's how I handle social encounters in a nutshell. Of course, the rules of the specific game that you're playing are going to make a huge difference on that, but I see these as far more than just simply talking in a voice around the table or just making a skill roll with zero thought as to how the player character is going to be doing this task. There are a lot of options and possible variables that can help or hinder a player character's chances while also making it really interesting and really fun to play. It's like in combat encounters, using the terrain and the obstacles, all the opportunities that the player characters have, and all the PC strategies and how it is they can work together rather than just simply saying, I swing my sword every single time the other turn comes up. And then once both the players and the game master, they start getting used to the idea that we can employ non-charisma stats and take into account the presentation of how the player character is dressed or whatever it is they're holding, or reading their opponent before the conversation begins to gauge the best strategy to use, or using the character's reputation either for or against them, or summing up the just dry portions of the conversation and focusing only on those important moments that can turn social encounters into some of the most exciting parts of the game.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see some more of our stuff, such as game reviews or how-tos, just hit that subscribe button. Till next time, amigos, stay awesome. I'm kind of surprised you don't require all your players to talk in character voices.
Nah, anyone that's ever watched me play knows that I am terrible at using character voices.
Not me, brother. I love doing character voices. Yeah, me too. Especially Lady Winifred Tightbottom, who is not amused with your tomfoolery.
Yeah, I'm terrible at them. It really ruins my immersion, having to remember to speak in some sort of special voice. It kind of stresses me out, really. Versus, I could get into my character's frame of mind and their personality and just talk like myself.
Oh, I hear you there.